everyone. My name is Sarah Ward, and I'm the Communications and Events Manager for the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. I'm often behind the scenes during the Mansfield Dialogue series, so I am delighted to join you tonight to introduce our speaker and moderator. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to honor the legacy of Mike Mansfield and his wife, Maureen Hayes. We work to bridge divides on local, national, and international levels and to support American democracy. We also work to inspire patriotism and support U.S. national security through both our domestic and international programs. Today's dialogue provides us with the opportunity to connect with Dr. Mark Clifford, author of The Troublemaker: How Jimmy Lai Became a Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Descendant, and China's Most Feared Critic. Dr. Clifford is president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, an NGO dedicated to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law for the people of Hong Kong. Previously, he was the executive director of the Hong Kong-based Asia Business Council and a board director at Next Digital, the Hong Kong media giant founded and majority-owned by Jimmy Lai. During his 28 years in Hong Kong, he served as editor-in-chief of both English-language newspapers, the South China Morning Post and The Standard, of which he was also the publisher. He holds a PhD in Hong Kong history from the University of Hong Kong. Clifford has won numerous journalism, academic, and book awards, and is the author of Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World: What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere. We are very grateful for his partnership and his willingness to engage our community in dialogue on such a critical subject. Tonight's event is also moderated by Peter Baker, Mansfield Center Director of International Affairs. Originally from Kalispell, Peter completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Montana, and then began a career in international education and higher education administration that has spanned past 20 years. During that time, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer, Presidential Management Fellow, and Senior Program Officer at the U.S. Department of Education's International Programs Division in D.C., as a Regional Director for the U.S. Department of State's programs in Brussels, Belgium, and some other stops along the way. In his free time, he enjoys traveling, staying active in Montana's great outdoors, and spending time with friends and family. We'd like to thank you all again for joining us tonight for tonight's dialogue. You are welcome to submit questions throughout the event using the question and answer feature, and we will do our best to include those questions over the course of the event. Thank you again to our speaker and moderator, and with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Clifford.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks, Peter, for moderating. Thanks to everybody at the Mansfield Center. I'm delighted to have the chance to talk to you this evening. I'm going to start with a slideshow. I'm going to go through for about 20 minutes or so. That's going to give you a sense, I think, of who Jimmy Lai as a man is, but also to put him in the context of the tremendous changes that happened in Hong Kong. So first slide, please. Whoops, one more. One more. This is Jimmy as a young boy. He's on the right. He had a twin sister who's in the center, and another sister who's 2 years older, and that's their mother in the background. He was born, he and his twin were born about 2 years before the Maoist revolution in China. He doesn't know exactly even what year he was born, but we think that he was born in 1947 or 48. The family, like so many families in China, was ripped apart by the Maoist revolution. His father fled to Hong Kong. The father had married a first wife who was from a prosperous shipping family, but he left his Jimmy's mother and the 3 kids back in Guangzhou, not far from Hong Kong, up the Pearl River Delta. And it was a time of incredible political struggle and privation. His mother, who had been a peasant, but had married into a wealthy family, was derided as a class enemy. And Jimmy, as a young boy, had to watch his mother walk on her knees on ground glass, wearing a dunce's cap, being subjected to jeers and humiliation from other people. She was in and out of a labor camp. And from the age of 4 or 6, Jimmy and CY, his twin, and their older sister were left to fend for themselves. It's just a time of unbelievable difficulty. But so you think of this guy, he was a primary school dropout. He was hustling on the black market at the age of 6, 8, 10. And finally, at the age of 11 or so, he decided he really wanted to go to Hong Kong, and he begged his mother for a year. Finally, she let him go after a year, and it took me a long time to really figure this out. Like, why would a mother let her, her son go to a British colony, escape China? He might die on the way or while he was there. And then it hit me. Jimmy left at a time when 45 million people were dying of famine, of hunger, of a politically induced famine, the worst in history. And so you think of Jimmy coming out of this kind of street urchin, almost juvenile delinquent childhood, desperate to go to Hong Kong. Which next slide, please. So that's him right before he left. I mean, this kid, right? 11, 12 years old. Next slide, please. He came to Hong Kong as an illegal immigrant. This is what Hong Kong looked like at the time. There were about 3 million people. Half of them were refugees like Jimmy from China. Hundreds of thousands of people living on the streets. And next slide, please. And also living in shanty towns like this. He had one name, his aunt, his mother's sister. She was living with her husband in a place like this, so tiny, actually probably even worse than these, so small that there wasn't even room for Jimmy to sleep on the floor. So next slide, please. She found him a job in a glove making factory, and he spent the first night sleeping in the factory, spent many nights over the next few years. But he worked his way up, and he went from being a factory hand, a child laborer, to enjoying some measure of prosperity. The earlier photos from the early 1960s, this is from the mid 70s. And it was around this time that Jimmy found he went from being a factory hand, working in a factory, to owning a factory. And he bought next slide, please, bought a sweater making factory. It quickly became the largest sweater maker in Hong Kong, maybe even in Asia. He was selling to companies like the Limited, J.C. Penney, Kmart, the Polo, big U.S. brands. But he got bored with just making sweaters, so he decided he'd go into retail and sell them. He set up this company. This is him at his Giordano clothing store, which actually became the pattern, the model for Uniqlo. The head of Uniqlo came down and studied with Jimmy. And he's a bored, restless, brilliant entrepreneur, but he doesn't really like doing one thing too long. And he was about to go into fast food, to do for fast food what he'd done for retailing. So just pause here for a second. Think of this guy. He's come from absolute poverty, famine in China. He comes to Hong Kong. He's got enough to eat. He works his way up. Pretty soon, he goes from working in a factory to running a factory to becoming, really successful as a sweater maker, to becoming this pace setter in retail, really the father of fast fashion. And he's ready to go on to a new idea, food. But that was to change. Next slide, please. In 1989, spring of 1989, students in Beijing and students and workers and ordinary people around China rallied for more democracy. And it was the most sustained challenge to the Chinese Communist Party since it took over in 1949. And other than the events in Hong Kong, it still stands as that. Jimmy, who had been pretty apolitical, he was enraptured by the economic reforms happening in China, but he didn't want to get involved in politics. He saw what it did to his mother, what it did to his family. But the images of these kids, of these student leaders, and just bowled him over. These three people were to become quite important for him. Chai Ling, the woman on the left, Wu Kai-shi, a Uyghur student leader, and Wang Dan on the right. And he made T-shirts with images of each of them and sold them in his Giordano stores. He sent the money, more than $100,000, up to support the students in Beijing. He sent tents up. He was all in. I mean, Hong Kong was behind the students, but Jimmy stood out as a wealthy, well-resourced businessman who was willing to put his heart and his wallet behind the students. Next shot, please. Next slide. Unfortunately, it ended very badly, as many of you know, with the killings on June 3rd, June 4th, when hundreds, maybe thousands of people were killed in Beijing and around China, and the hopes of a generation were mowed down. Many of you will know this tank man shot with the guy on the left standing in front of the tank, and it only occurred to me after I'd done this slideshow a few times. Jimmy ultimately emerged as our generation's, the 21st century's tank man, trying to stand metaphorically in the way of China trying to destroy Hong Kong. So keep that image in mind. We'll go to the next shot. And so Jimmy decided he was going to go into media. He chucked the fast food idea. He said what the Chinese Communist Party needs, what China needs is more transparency, more accountability. He was convinced that the changes that were happening in the media, it's interesting, it was before the internet, but he saw things like CNN, he saw the real-time reporting of the Tiananmen killings. And, although he'd already decided to go into media before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Remember, 1989, the end of that year was when the Berlin Wall fell. A couple of years later, the Soviet Union was gone. So I think Jimmy saw the power of media, but he didn't want to do it in a staid way. And at that time, Hong Kong newspapers were black and white, few photos, just really text heavy. Jimmy wanted to do something different. He's a retailer, so he called his paper Apple Daily. This is Jimmy eating an apple, with the logo next to him. And uh, it didn't have anything to do with Apple Computer. It had to do with his budding sense of Catholicism. He converted to Catholicism in 1997. Excuse me. He said Eve ate the apple. That's where news started. If we didn't have the apple, we wouldn't have any news. So that was his explanation for where he came up with it. Next slide, please. Everybody in Hong Kong read the paper. This is Chris Patton, the last governor in Government House. I don't think he actually read Chinese, but it's a good photo. And more to the point, it shows the quality. I mean, this doesn't look that special today, but you think about it, the New York Times was all in black and white then. And so Jimmy brought color presses. He had the best presses in the world, Goss presses, fantastic ink, great paper, really high-end advertising, and a mix of everything from horse racing to stock market tips to Nobel Prize winning economists to reviews of brothels to investigative reporting and a very, very strong pro-democracy bent. And it quickly just took the city by storm. And remember, he launched in 1995. That's 2 years before the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong. Next shot, please. And this next shot is Martin Lee, the father of democracy in Hong Kong, who led the democratic movement, kind of the organized opposition for many years. Also a Catholic, very, very close to Jimmy. Again, you see the newspaper, huge photo, really bright colors, just a really eye-grabbing, kind of package. Next, please. And in 1997, the Chinese did in fact come. This is the handover ceremony when, after 156 years of British colonial rule, I would say very successful colonial rule, it was time for it to end. But unfortunately, it ended with Hong Kong being handed over to a very stern master. Next shot, please. Slide. Jimmy and Next Magazine, which along with Apple Daily were the core parts of his media empire, pursued, as I said, always pursued a really strong pro-democracy agenda. And in 2003, when the government, for the first time, tried to introduce national security legislation, Jimmy and Apple and Next managed to work to get 500,000 people out in the streets. Hong Kong had never seen anything like this since China had come. During Tiananmen, there had been one rally that size, but people have been pretty quiescent after the handover. And when this law first was mooted, there were 20 opposition people around a bonfire burning a copy of it. So to go from 20 people to 500,000 in about a half a year or so really forced the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities to wake up. What you see in this picture is a pullout from Next Magazine, which was purpose built to be, as you see, there are several of them, to be a poster, a campaign, or a protest poster. That photoshopped hand pushing the custard pie into the face of someone. That's the leader of Hong Kong, Tung Chee-hwa, who was very genial, very proper kind of Confucian style, or saw himself as a Confucian style gentleman. He was not amused. Next shot, please. But what you did see, this is another picture from that July 1st, 2003. Just see this very joyous day, completely peaceful. Traffic for the most part, being kept away. Those are the Hong Kong trams there. You had people of all ages, from a few months to almost 100 years old. It was a real festival, and it was a real I think it was a real poke in China's eyes because it had, by that point it had had Hong Kong for 6 years. It was the sixth anniversary of the handover, and it thought that it kind of had the Hong Kong people under control. This was the first time, real tangible sign that it wasn't going to be so easy for China to swallow Hong Kong. And again, Jimmy and Next and Apple were right at the center of it. Next shot, please. We're fast forwarding 10 years now. This is, or 11 years. This is 2014, the umbrella movement, or the so-called Occupy Central movement. Jimmy had never been a frontline kind of person. He's actually quite shy. I mean, he likes inviting people over for dinner, like small groups of friends, but he wasn't the guy who was going to take to the stage. He wasn't trying to be the next Nelson Mandela or Lech Walesa. He just wasn't out. He'd go to the rallies, but he didn't take a leading role. And in 2014, when people like Jimmy and Martin Lee and others of his generation were kind of pulling back, Jimmy wanted to show solidarity with the students, and this was after a Sunday in which an extraordinary amount of tear gas, by Hong Kong standards, by historical standards, was fired. And there's Jimmy, coughing and choking and suffering like thousands of other people. That's obviously central in the background. And in the next shot, we will see Occupy Central, which you see all those tents. There were thousands and thousands of tents for 79 days, with people pushing for more democracy. Jimmy pitched a tent. He was there every single day, every single one of those 79 days. He missed his son Sebastian's birthday. I think it was his 20th birthday, because he wanted to sit there in solidarity with students. He had pig guts dumped on him by pro-Beijing thugs, but he just kind of sat there like an ordinary person, talking to anybody he wanted to talk to, but not making a big deal about who he was. And that's something to remember. He is, really a modest and, as I said, somewhat shy and retiring kind of guy who just, he's also quite stubborn, and as he, in his own words, is a troublemaker. And so he doesn't yield easily, but he's not trying to run things. He's trying to make a point and stand up for principles. Next, please. And here he is at the end of that 79 days, offering himself up for arrest. He was arrested, but ultimately not prosecuted. Next, please. And I want to show you, remind you, Jimmy is a man. As I said, we'll see some pictures of the kids later on. This is Jimmy. We were in New Orleans in 2017, taking a trip around America. And that's his wife, Teresa, who's an absolute rock, was responsible for his conversion to Catholicism, but much more than that, just really helps hold him together. And at, I would say, considerable personal risk, continues to stay in Hong Kong, continues to attend every day of his trial, which is over 140 days so far, and visits him in prison virtually every week. So anyway, I just want to remind you that we often think of political prisoners as just these hard, old ascetic people. And Jimmy's a guy who loves life. He loves food. He loves his wife. He loves his kids. And it's important to remember. Next, please. Now we go ahead to 2019. So 2014, we had the 79 days of occupation. We had something similar in 2019, and we can think of those as that 2014, 2019 period as kind of bookends that bracketed a period of increasing political tension, with Hong Kong people demanding that China live up to the promises that it made to Hong Kong when it took over from Britain. It signed an international treaty with Britain. It ended up imposing a mini constitution on Hong Kong. And both of these documents contained promises that Hong Kong's way of life, its freedoms, its rule of law, its currency, its civil service, that its separateness from China would remain for 50 years. And that included, as I said, the common law tradition, but also freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, all the freedoms that we take for granted in the United States and other open societies. And it wasn't happening. China was rolling things back. It was abducting people and taking them to the mainland. It was essentially trying to crush Hong Kong and make it more like a mainland city. And extraordinary numbers of people came out in 2019 in opposition to a bill that would have chipped away at Hong Kong's autonomy by making it easy to send people over to China over to mainland China for prosecution in court. And I think everybody in Hong Kong knew that's it. you breach that wall, and there's no separateness for Hong Kong. If you're a businessman who gets in a dispute with your colleagues in China, you can be extradited. There's little hope for you. So these crowds over a period of several months would total as many as 2 million people. I mean, you think of 2 million people. They weren't coming from China. They were all from Hong Kong, from a city of 7.5 million people. It would be the proportional equivalent of 90 million people were marching in the US on Washington. Next shot, please. I'm going to go through the rest of these much more quickly, but I just want to give you a sense of that feeling in 2019. Next. Yeah, and this is a nighttime rally. Again, you can just see tens, hundreds of thousands of people out again and again. Next. These are so-called Lenin walls. Those are little post-it stickers where people are writing, support for democracy and for political change. And these were all over Hong Kong. Next. This is Jimmy, August 18th, 2019. He was ultimately jailed for this, marching in a rally. Next. This is lunchtime in a shopping mall where a flash mob has a pro-democracy protest. Next. This is Jimmy with Martin Lee in the center, who I mentioned before, the pro-democracy campaigner, and John Lewis, the revered civil rights icon. Excuse me. And they met in the Capitol when just by chance when Jimmy and Martin were visiting in 2019, and I thought it was nice to see this amazing American civil rights leader with Jimmy Lai. What did Jimmy do? Pulled out a phone and asked John Lewis to make a video imploring the students to stick to nonviolence. As John Lewis, of course, was an exponent of nonviolent change, as is Jimmy. So just a great historical photo. Next, please. There's Jimmy, August 10th, 2020. So about a year after that previous picture, where he was arrested on national security law charges, ritually humiliated, marched out of his house. Next shot, please. And then at the same time, we had, and I was on the board of directors at the time, we had 250 police come into our newsroom. Next, please. And start carting away evidence. They ended up taking everything by the time it was all over. Next, please. Here's Jimmy being perp walked through the newsroom that same day. His staff was amazing. One journalist, amazing woman, was interviewing him as he's being perp walked by the cops. Next, please. We'll go through these pretty quickly. Here he is being taken, into the police station. Next, please. Getting out, he was held for a couple of days. So the national security law, as a reminder, the one that they fought against so successfully in 2003 was eventually imposed by Beijing illegally. I think many people would argue on June 30th, 2020. That raid and these events are from the first half of August. The raid was August 10th. I think he's getting out just before midnight on August 12th. So things were happening pretty fast. Next, please. And by December, his bail was revoked. I think you can see in the pictures he's being manacled and marched in chains, as he often is when he's moved around in Hong Kong. My understanding, he's typically chained inside a cage, inside a kind of oversized Brinks armored car. There are typically hundreds of police, dozens of dogs, like he's some kind of violent terrorist. Again, a man who's used the power of the pen, has always preached the importance of nonviolence, but he's emblematic of China's desire to crush Hong Kong and crush, not only one of the great, freedom fighters of the city and of his age, but also one of the greatest entrepreneurs the city ever produced. Next. This is the last day of Apple Daily, June 24th, 2021. The government, we got a letter, directors got a letter from the Secretary for Security, John Lee, who's now kind of the mayor of Hong Kong, the chief executive. And he told us that he thought we'd broken the national security law. There wasn't one shred of evidence. It was on his say-so. He suspected we'd broken the law. Therefore, he was freezing our bank accounts. We couldn't pay the printers. We couldn't pay for ink. We couldn't pay for paper. Couldn't pay our staff. We had almost 1,000 staff at that point. So we had no choice but to cease publication. Next, please. This is the last known picture of Jimmy, July 2023. So coming up on 2 years. He's been held in solitary confinement for most of these 4+ years, more than 1,530 days, almost 1,540 days now. He gets 45 or 50 minutes of fresh air, sunlight, exercise a day. For her pains in surreptitiously taking this picture with a long lens into Stanley Prison, the AP Associated Press photographer who did this was kicked out of Hong Kong. Authorities seem terrified of images of Jimmy getting out. Next, please. Just a couple words. Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation is working on behalf of not only Jimmy Lai, but the 1,000 or so political prisoners in Hong Kong. We can talk more. We mostly do legislative and parliamentary and government work, do a lot of media research, but we also like to do whatever we can to keep the spotlight quite literally on Hong Kong. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Next shot, please. We just were try to literally spotlight Jimmy. This is also the Guggenheim. Next, please. Next shot is Washington, D.C., Department of Energy. You can see the Capitol over there on the right. Next, please, is London, Tower Bridge in London, Free Jimmy Lai and the Apple 7. 6 other colleagues are in jail as well as Jimmy. Next, please. That's Teresa. That's their daughter, Claire, and in the back, their son, Augustin. Next, please. And that's just a shot of Jimmy shortly before he was imprisoned. In the back is a painting by Wallace Ting, a fantastic Chinese American artist who's unfortunately since died. Jimmy was quite close personal friends with him. In fact, took time off and went and studied art with Wallace in Amsterdam, in his studio in Amsterdam, in the mid 1990s, which has served him in good stead because he spends a lot of time in prison drawing. He draws religious subjects exclusively, really quite a good artist. And it was, I've known him for a long time. I was just really struck when I thought about his design sense, his color sense, his artistic sense. He and Teresa used to spend lots of time every year going around looking at paintings, museums, and we could talk about this more, but he has this very, very unusual sense of color and design, which he used to affect when he was, making sweaters, when he was at Giordano, and eventually I think he's using in prison. Next, I think we're pretty much done here, but yep, that's me. Next shot, and I think we can just go over to Peter now.
Mark, thank you again for joining us and sharing this important and widely unknown story, vital story to this audience. I'd like to start by maybe having you tell us a bit about your story, specifically how you began your work, when you began your work in Hong Kong, and maybe a memory that you have about your first meeting with Jimmy, when you first got to know him.
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, again, thanks, Peter, for moderating this and for everybody who's watching. I moved down to Hong Kong in June 1992. I mentioned that because it was a month before Chris Patton, the last governor, came. So there was already all this kind of frisson of excitement and anticipation and fear about the Chinese takeover. And of course, it was 3 years after the Tiananmen killings. And, at that time, the slogan in Hong Kong was today's China is tomorrow's Hong Kong. And that was not something to look forward to. So there was real uncertainty about the future. Chris Patton, whose picture you saw before, is a breath of fresh air. He really tried to push democracy more, which the British were woefully slow for the first 150+ years. And anyway, I've been in Korea 5 years. I've been lucky enough to see the democratization process unfold there in the late 1980s when I was at the Far Eastern Economic Review. And the trend seemed to be in the right direction. The Philippines had the People's Power movement. Taiwan had ended martial law and was moving towards more democracy. So Asia seemed on the roll, and even China seemed like it was opening up. And especially after Korea, I mean, I loved Korea, but it's a very hierarchical, rigid place, and you don't just go and meet the CEO of one thing or another. And Jimmy was pointed out to me as a really interesting guy, uh, fantastic entrepreneur. I was working for the Far Eastern Economic Review then. He was really known for what he'd done at Giordano and in the sweater and the textile business. And he, had this little fledgling media operation. He'd been kind of a loudmouth when it came to when it came to pro-democracy things. So I called him up. His secretary said he wants to invite you to lunch. He's kind of retired, but he'll invite you to lunch at his house. Oh, that's great. Go to this mansion up in the hills overlooking Kowloon, and he cooked lunch for me. And it was rare enough to have a CEO, invite me for lunch, but I never before or after had one cook for me. And he made a really nice Chinese stir fry, veggies, shrimp, I think some chicken, and just had a really nice meal. And like many other people, I was just captivated by this guy, his story. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the media business in Hong Kong. This was 2 years before Apple had been launched, the magazine had been launched, and it was doing well, but it wasn't throwing off money or anything. And he analyzed very shrewdly in a very business-like sense why Apple could work. And in a nutshell, Hong Kong people wanted democracy. We'd had the first ever territory-wide elections in 1991, so 2 years earlier, and everybody was shocked because about 6 out of 10 people voted for the pro-democracy candidates. Jimmy said, "Look, people in Hong Kong want democracy. All my competitors in the media business are pulling back because they're afraid of China." He went through one by one. I mean, Hong Kong is a really tough, big, brutal media market. But he's like, "Look, I got a moat." If you take Warren Buffett's analogy, he's like, "I've got a moat around my business. I've got something people want. I can produce something, democracy, or coverage of democracy, fighting for democracy. And nobody's going to challenge me. I've got this." He really looked at it as a business person. And although he always cared about democracy, he went into that business wanting to make money. And in fact, several people suggested at first he wanted to start the magazine and just sell it. And he's like, "It's too much trouble. Who'd want to run a magazine?" So, but then he got bitten by the media bug, as many of us do. And so, I stayed in touch with him over the years and I only went on the board in 2018. And at that point, funnily enough, we were really focused on making the transition from print to digital, which Hong Kong was quite slow, but we did incredibly quickly and had probably the most rapid take up in the world. So, yeah. So, I've known him for those 30 years, see him quite often. Sometimes would write about him, profile him. Sometimes would see him socially, but yeah.
Thank you. And in those discussions, as you got to know him over the years, um, I'm curious if you heard from him, if he explained how he made sense of, especially the hardships that he had encountered at the beginning of his life, what he saw his family go through, how he, as a young boy, immigrated to Hong Kong, the hard work that he did as a young boy as well. How did you make sense of that, and maybe some of the values that came from that informed his work moving forward and that he carried with him?
Yeah, interestingly, Jimmy's one of these people who just looks forward. He's a very optimistic guy, even when he's kind of a little bit fatalistic. I never heard him, or I very, very rarely heard him talk about his childhood. Much of the book is, in terms of that part, is based on either talking to a few people who knew him well, and there are not many around, um, especially from his real childhood. And he wrote a column a week for Next. He wrote over 1,500 columns, and he was amazingly frank in these columns, very, very interesting. But he wasn't a guy who complained. And family members, everybody who knows him, he's in horrific conditions right now. You think of it, solitary confinement. If it's over 15 days, the United Nations defines it as torture, and for him, it's been more than 100 times as long. He doesn't complain about it. So he's not a complainer. But when it comes to values, and it's a really interesting question, Peter, because he had this kind of visceral hatred of the communists because of what they'd done to his family, ripping the family apart. Just, yeah, and but it wasn't well formed. As I said, he's a primary school dropout. But he'd spent a lot of time in New York. It was like a second home to him when he was in the textile business, especially making the sweaters. And one night he's kind of adopted by a family I'm in New York right now. And one night the guy took him to dinner, and after dinner, the host, having listened to Jimmy, kind of go on about the communists, is kind of like, "You need to read something to kind of, get beyond, just your raw hatred of them. You need to put this a little more structure on this." And he reached over to his bookshelf and he pulled out Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which really warned about the danger of yeah, of economic planning and of communism and how it would lead to, the loss of political freedom. And, Hayek is actually a much more supple thinker than many people give him credit for. And he's not like against, state being involved in certain things. But he, this gave Jimmy, I mean, Jimmy just scarfed this up. He read just about everything he could by Hayek. He said he didn't get some of the economic stuff. And then he started reading Karl Popper and other kind of political theorists who are really focused on freedom. And he's a voracious reader. He's like, I think like many people who don't have, a lot of formal education, he's just, he's desperate to learn more because he always felt like he left out. He was left out. Even when he was a kid, I was told, when we were still in China, he couldn't read. He had a big book on his lap. It would be upside down, but he wanted to look like he was reading. It's a big book. So, he's had this fascination with education, but he's such a charming guy. And so, for example, Milton Friedman came to Hong Kong, met Jimmy. There was a trip. They all went around China together. He became fast friends. He and Teresa became fast friends with Milton and Rose Friedman. He's in Friedman's in their memoirs and things. That wasn't because he was a rich guy. It's because he was an interesting guy who was engaged with the world, engaged with ideas, and obviously was very much on the same wavelength as Friedman. I mean, Jimmy's pretty much a libertarian. I mean, he grew up in a Hong Kong that had very few regulations. That was a real scrappy dog eat dog sort of capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism. Friedman loved Hong Kong, and I think Jimmy was one of the people he loved the most there.
Thank you. Related to this, maybe a wider, consideration of his identity and how complicated that is from China, as you mentioned, and the government using him continuing to be detained, as I understand it, not as a British citizen, but as a Chinese citizen as well, as I understand it. So his identity, having been born in China, having gone and lived in Hong Kong for most of his life, and then he's a British citizen in his Catholic faith. So how would he identify himself, his identity?
Again, Peter, fantastic question. Very difficult to answer. First of all, he's a Hong Konger. This just came up in court recently in an extraordinary exchange. The government said, they're this judge. There are three judges, handpicked judges in his national security law trial. And and by the way, think of that. Those pictures that I showed you were from August 2020. So we're coming up on 5 years of the trial. And in fact, the closing arguments are set to start on August 14th. So just after the 5-year anniversary, they still haven't tried him. The judge said to him, "You're Chinese." He said, "I'm Hong Konger." The judge said, "You're yellow, right?" And he goes, "I'm a Hong Konger." I mean, I don't know where they find these judges, but anyway, so he said he defines himself as a Hong Konger. Now, culturally, I think he's incredibly proud and even patriotic as a Chinese person who wants the best for China. But he despises the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, he just thinks that they're holding China back, that their corruption, their amorality, their lack of concern for people, their unwillingness to really let freedom and the free spirits of the Chinese people, whether it's in religion or it's in business or it's in media, refusal to allow those to flourish, and quite the contrary, is holding China back. But it's interesting because, so as you say, born in China, technically Chinese, but it wasn't the People's Republic of China then. He left legally on a one-way exit permit to go to Macau, the nearby Portuguese colony. Uh, as far as I can tell, that's the last time that he used Chinese papers. He then stowed away on a smuggling boat and was secreted into Hong Kong and got British citizenship as part of a program right after the Tiananmen killings, trying to keep people like Jimmy from fleeing Hong Kong. And he got full British citizenship in 1992. He's never had a Chinese passport, and yet, the Chinese say he's Chinese. We don't recognize dual nationality. Well, he's not a dual national. He's British. He's Chinese because, I guess, quote unquote, to paraphrase the judge, he's yellow. He was born in China, so he's a son of the Yellow Emperor, as the Chinese say. I mean, it's the craziest thing, which has no basis in international law. But to, finish up answering your question, the Chinese and the Hong Kong authorities are denying him consular access to British diplomats. So he's been in jail for 4+ years, and he's never had one single consular meeting with a British embassy or consulate official. Now, the British say they're trying, but I don't know. Whatever they're doing, it's not working.
Thank you. Part of his identity as well is obviously his entrepreneurial spirit. He did a variety of things professionally. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. He came over as an immigrant. He worked, as you mentioned, in textile factories. He went into retail. I think fast food was part of his background as well. And then in 1995, he went into journalism with the newspapers. So talk about that evolution that he went through, and maybe how that mirrors the story a bit of Hong Kong generally, especially in the post-war years.
Yeah, well, as you saw from those pictures of people sleeping on the streets and living in these shanty towns, I mean, Hong Kong was unbelievably poor. I mean, half the population, 1.5 million or so of the 3 million people when Jimmy came were immigrants from China. I mean, virtually all of them illegal. I mean, the government was overwhelmed, housing problems, health problems. I mean, you had TB, malaria, I can't remember, typhus. I mean, kind of every disease possible. You had the communists and the Kuomintang, the nationalists from Taiwan, fighting each other on the streets. I mean, the place was chaos. And so, letting, just kind of having a laissez-faire attitude towards the economy, although building housing, a lot of public housing, even today, about half the people live in public housing, and healthcare. Healthcare is basically free in Hong Kong. Provided a base. There was no minimum wage until 2009. So as I said, it was a scrappy dog eat dog about the rawest form of capitalism you can imagine. And yet it went from those scenes of people sleeping on the streets to a level of prosperity that rivals the US now. And it did it with people like Jimmy, thousands and thousands of people like Jimmy who were entrepreneurs, and hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are the workers, as Jimmy started out. But you just think of, this guy comes in and his aunt takes him out. He's sleeping on the table in the factory, and he wakes up the next morning. He's written about it, beautifully. He wakes up the next morning, he just smells rice, congee, rice porridge, and dough sticks, and he's just like, wow, this is food. This is the smell of freedom. Food is freedom for him at first. Then he starts making some money, and then freedom is the freedom to work and have his own place and be able to go out to restaurants and eat a little better food. And then freedom's the freedom to buy his own business and become, an international, really a well-known international tycoon selling to the, I mean, he was chartering jumbo jets and flying them to Columbus, Ohio for the Limited. I mean, I had people at the Limited who said, I built my first house on Jimmy Lai, who was brilliant at getting around textile quotas. It's funny that we're going back to tariffs now because a guy like Jimmy Lai is going to have it figured out, but he figured all the angles out. Then he, gets tired of the people at the Limited taking all the profits. Says, I'm going to take some profits as a retailer, and yeah, then was about to go into food, and then actually started the magazine very quickly right after Tiananmen in 1990, and then took a while longer to get the newspaper going. So then there's a freedom to own a business, and there's a freedom to talk about politics and be engaged in politics and be have a megaphone as a media entrepreneur. Say what you like because Hong Kong's a free place. There's free speech. He attacked the Chinese premier, Li Peng, as the butcher of Beijing, which we could talk about. The Chinese didn't like. Then he finds the freedom of love, of religion, of salvation through God. No coincidence that he converted a week after the handover in 1997, and I guess he's found a different kind of freedom in prison right now, but I think he's free, I think, in his head, but obviously he'd like to be free physically and be back with his family. So to your point, there are these different, it's almost like Maslow's, hierarchy of needs. It starts off with a really basic stuff, food, kind of goes up from there and ends up with political freedom, religious freedom, kind of spiritual salvation, love of his wife. And then it all comes crashing down because China can't keep its promises to the people of Hong Kong. It has to crush. And again, I want to remind people who are watching or listening, there are 1,000 political prisoners in Hong Kong, as best as we can tell. There are over 1,900 who have been tried, convicted, jailed over the last 5 years. You think of that, 1,900 people in a city smaller than New York City, about 7.5 million people, in for almost completely for nonviolent offenses, just for trying to hold China accountable for its promises, which included full universal suffrage. And that's what people like Jimmy were working for. They weren't working for independence or right, terrorism or revolution or anything. They were trying to get China to keep its promise to let's be basic. They wanted to elect the mayor and the city council, and China just couldn't take it. And so I think that China has, just again to kind of wrap up, it's worth remembering in 75 years of Chinese communist rule, I don't think they've ever met a person quite like Jimmy Lai. Brilliant entrepreneur. So he's got money, he's got international connections, he can hire the best lawyers, people around the world, politicians know him. He had the media megaphone. And I think anybody who knows the smallest thing about communism knows that the party has to control the media because it sees that as propaganda. And then the third thing, I think, so money, media. The third thing, though, is just values and principles. And I think this may be the one that's hardest for the Chinese communists to really get their head around, because as far as I can see, they really don't have any principles. They're into power. They're often into money. They're not the kind of people who are going to go and spend, actually, most of us are not either, right? Let's be honest. Most people are not going to go and spend potentially the rest of their life in prison fighting for an ideal, trying to keep the spotlight on Hong Kong, trying to keep China to keep its promises.
Thank you. Informed, influenced by the events of 1989, Tiananmen Square, his magazine in 1990, and then 1995 with the newspaper. We saw what happened to him, but in general, what is the state of free press in Hong Kong today?
There really isn't any. I mean, there are some small publications, there's some online places, there's some diaspora media, but the kind of reporting that Apple did is just out of the question. Even small things like a former one of the most prominent legal professors in Hong Kong, who's now in exile, wrote a piece for it's called the Ming Pao newspaper, which is still tries to push the envelope a little bit. And they were, the paper and this guy were trashed by the Secretary for Security. And these kinds of warnings, these kinds of trashings are often a prelude to arrests. There are the 7 journalists I mentioned from Apple Daily in jail. There are also quite a few others in jail from other publications. So, free press is a thing of the past. It just doesn't exist in Hong Kong anymore.
And these are your colleagues. These were your colleagues that are in prison now, including Jimmy. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of media generally, a free press during this time, and Apple and Next specifically, in context of the degree to which they influenced and led what we saw in those evocative pictures that you provided in 2003, 2014, and 2020. Without them, would that have happened, or was that the tip of the spear in terms of providing a voice for those movements?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to argue counterfactual history, but they played an absolute pivotal role. Certainly in 2003, as I said, in October, the previous October, you had 20 people around a bonfire and burning a copy of this proposed law. And in July, you have 500,000 people, and that wasn't because the opposition political parties were rallying people. It was above all Next and Apple. Um, and fast forward to 2014 or some of the other political movements. I mean, I don't want to say it's 100% Apple. Obviously, there were 2 million Hong Kong people, but I think Apple helped give a voice and catalyze people's thinking. But we could, this might be getting a little bit granular, but many of the younger students, as I alluded to before, felt that people like Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee had kind of they were past their sell-by date, and they'd been had peaceful protests and tried to work inside the system for 30 years, and where it had gotten anybody. So a lot of the students actually by 2014 felt that Apple was, they were being left behind. And that's one reason Jimmy wanted to sit out there and show solidarity. It wasn't because he wanted to lead, but it's like he wanted to show solidarity to the students. They were often frustrated that Apple wasn't more aggressive. So, again, it's counterfactual. It's hard to argue, but Apple used more yellow ink because it was the yellow umbrella movement. So, this great color press, they used more yellow ink in 2014 than they had, in the previous 20 years that they've been in existence. So they were pretty full in, but they also alienated people, because I know people whose parents, had liked Apple, and in 2014 they thought they were too radical. So, it wasn't like they were the only game in town. There were some more radical, more online places in particular. There was a growing independence movement. There was more violence. Jimmy and Apple were really against that. So, yeah, I don't want to say they were the only game, but they were, yeah, I think everybody agrees they were the most important. And the final point I'd make is that opposition political parties were deliberately neutered and fragmented. So they didn't, even though they'd win 6 out of 10 votes in every single free election from 1991 until 2019, they could never take power. And so yeah, the opposition political parties they just didn't matter that much. I mean, Apple had an outsized role because the political parties were neutered.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the increased, as time went on, from the handover in 1997 up until 2020 and today, about China's increased role, its authority in Hong Kong, the degree to which you think that is China being responsive to dynamic events such as these protests that we saw, or was this perhaps part of a more scripted project, gradual project that was intended all along?
I would say more the latter, that it was part of a scripted project. I think China fundamentally misunderstands Hong Kong, and it goes back to the colonial days when they had the Xinhua news service was their kind of, de facto consulate, ears on the ground. And those guys talked to the leftists in Hong Kong, of which there were some, and the pro-Beijing people, and the business pro-Beijing business people. And they have consistently not had any real links with the Hong Kong people. I would say that's true of the Hong Kong government as well. And so there's this constant misreading. And it's, first of all, in 1997, there was this idea that the Hong Kong people were going to just embrace the PLA and the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese coming in. And yes, there were people who, took the flags that were given to them by Chinese United Front organizations and waved the flags. And, I think people had a cautious attitude, but Hong Kong people value freedom. Virtually every one of the 7.5 million people in the city either fled China, or their parents fled, or their grandparents fled. They know what the Chinese communists are about. They're in Hong Kong because China's lousy because of the party. So why the party would think that people would welcome them, like this kind of liberation from these colonial oppressors, which, I don't, and look, I don't want to minimize the racism and the other problems of the colonial period, but, it was a place, particularly towards the end, where Chinese people had a fair shot, and they had a fair shot in courts above all, which they didn't in the mainland. So I think there was this fundamental misreading. So I think that the script, Peter, was that they were going to be full, free, universal suffrage elections, at least for the city council, for the legislative council, 10 years after the handover. And I think China thought that it would have, beaten, bullied, cajoled, carrots and sticks. They could have won a kind of fair-ish election. And they didn't. They kept losing the elections. They lost the Hong Kong people. And so the Hong Kong people veered off script. And so then China was reacting to dynamic events. I mean, in 2012, 2 years before that umbrella movement, you had a 15-year-old kid, Joshua Wong, who was bringing 50,000 people out in the streets to protest against changes in educational curriculum, which would have been, more pro-communist. I mean, yeah, I remember one night getting my hair cut from my longtime barber, and he's like, "Yeah, as soon as I'm done here, I'm going over to the rally." I'm like, "What?" I mean, this was hardly even being covered in the press, in the English language press. And there'd be like 50,000 people out there, and then there are hundreds of thousands, right? So, I got to give the Hong Kong people credit. They fought for freedom, and China didn't think they would.
Thank you. To zoom out a little bit with that in mind, I'm wondering what you think Jimmy's story and Hong Kong's story can tell us, can help inform us about modern day China's ambitions, including some things, some priorities that it might have moving forward in the region and even more widely?
Yeah, well, I think they want to control all of us, and as you or as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, my previous book subtitle was "What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere," and some people at the time thought that was a little over the top, some reviewers and other people, and but I think events in the last couple of years have proven me correct. So first of all, Hong Kong, China cannot be trusted. It broke an international treaty that signed with the United Kingdom in 1984, governing its conduct after the handover for the next 50 years. It unilaterally tore up that treaty in 2017 on the 20th anniversary of the handover. So can't be trusted. It also they broke the basic law, which China itself wrote as a mini constitution for Hong Kong. But I think what's become even more troubling for me in the last couple of years is the attempt to try to impose the national security law globally. So I have two colleagues from Hong Kong. Both of them have bounties on their heads, about $130,000 if you can bring Chloe Chung or Francis Hui back to Hong Kong so that they can be prosecuted. These are activists. I think the case, and one lives in the U.S. Francis has asylum in the U.S. Chloe's been living in Britain for the last 5 years. The case of Chloe is particularly troubling. She came as a 15-year-old. She joined us right out of high school to do a gap year. She's got this bounty on her head because the government doesn't like what she's doing for us and the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. So think about the audacity of that. This young woman has come with her family to seek freedom and expects protection and safety in the United Kingdom. And that's they can't provide that. The government says we're going to hunt you down. John Lee, the chief executive, has described the 19 people of bounties. They're going to hunt them down like street rats to the end of the earth. It's like the Iranian fatwa against Salman Rushdie. I mean, this is no joke. And the British government hasn't really pushed back. The U.S. has been a little more aggressive, but it's I think it's just really troubling that China wants to decide. Excuse me, and I'm running across this too. They want to decide if I go to Houston or San Francisco or whatever that I can't speak at certain places. And so you think about the impact that that not every place is like the Mansfield Center. It's going to invite me. I get things like, yeah, really interesting. Sorry, can't do that. I mean, people are really afraid of China, and China's not afraid to throw its muscle around. So I think it's a really, really worrying sign.
You. And last question for you. This is obviously a human story, Jimmy's story, your colleagues' stories who are also in prison. If you could remind us about the conditions of Jimmy, where he is in his process, and what the audience can do if they're interested to make their voices heard about this or to help.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I am conscious we're short of time, but yeah, Jimmy's in prison, mostly in a maximum security prison at Stanley, sometimes at a prison closer to court. He is serving a sentence right now of 5 years and 9 months for a lease violation. It's so granular and technical. Nobody in Hong Kong has ever gone to jail. It's the equivalent of me renting an apartment from you and you say no cats and I bring a cat in there. It was kind of it's just crazy, but the law is being weaponized against Jimmy. They'll do anything to keep him in jail. 100% certainty that he's going to be found guilty in his national security trial, which we now hope will wrap up at the end of this year. So 5 years after, more than 5 years after he's first arrested. Um, Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation and other groups, Hong Kong Democracy Council, Hong Kong Watch. I mean, there's a whole IPAC, Inter-Parliamentary Association Against China. There's a whole ecosystem of groups that are trying to push back against China. And of course, we work against the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. We work with June 4th, Tiananmen people, Han Chinese, Uyghurs, Tibetans. And I think we all just need to, in terms of people supporting, we have a pretty robust legislative agenda we're working on to, for example, shut Hong Kong economic and trade offices in San Francisco, Washington, and New York that are kind of quasi-diplomatic outposts that are now being used to harass and spy on dissident Hong Kongers. Push back. Push your legislators to take China seriously. They don't want freedom. They don't want us to be able to talk about Tibet or Taiwan. And you did ask kind of what comes next for the region. Well, if they can roll into Hong Kong, it's that much faster they're going to roll into Taiwan. And I think one of the things we want to do is keep raising the cost for the Chinese Communist Party for its suppression of Hong Kong, and to make it so that Jimmy Lai and the other 1,000 political prisoners are more trouble in prison than they'd be if they were let out. And I hope that China can see the wisdom of allowing a global financial center to become free again, and to have the ability to prosper in a way that it can't when it's holding these kinds of political prisoners and it's cracked down on freedom to the extent that it has.
Mark Clifford, thank you very much for joining us and sharing this essential story. My name is Peter Baker on behalf of the Mansfield Center. We'll see you at the next dialogue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.